To the right is the so-called sounding arch, which has an echo.
Hello? Hello?
Chippingham Viaduct has 9 archways with road traffic running through 2 of them. The Hanwell Viaduct, spanning the Brent Valley, is 960 feet long and supported by piers, showing an Egyptian influence. A handful of cast-iron bridges are known to remain. The Uxbridge Road Bridge, just up from Warncliffe Viaduct, still has one octagonal column and its original abutment walls, although the rest is 20th century. And close by there is the Windmill Bridge, which offered a daunting challenge. The structure is actually 2 bridges with road, rail and canal all intersecting at different angles. A bridge already existed over the canal before Brunel cunningly planned to take the Great Western Railway line through a cutting under both the canal and the road. He accomplished this tricky engineering feat by designing massive brick arches at the lower level and a trough supported by huge metal beams to carry the road above the canal. Chepstow Bridge's original cast-iron columns survive, as do the massive abutments on the English side. Many of his fine masonry bridges remain, including a skew bridge, carrying the South Devon line over the road at Plimpton at 63 degrees skew. And the elegant 6-arch viaduct carrying the Taff Vale Railway over the River Taff in Glamorgan. Isambard had a number of romantic liaisons, but it wasn't until 1832 that he met his future wife, a 19-year-old beauty, Mary Horsley from Kensington. The Horsley family home at 1 High Road, Kensington, still stands as 128 Kensington Church Street, and the house remains much the same. Owing to Brunel's heavy work commitment, they had to wait for 4 years before they could get married. But with his new position with the Great Western Railway, he was then financially stable, and they were married at St. Mary's Parish Church, Kensington, on the 5th of July, 1836. After a 2-week honeymoon in Wales, they set up home in London at 18 Duke Street overlooking St. James's Park. This was to be the family home for the remainder of his life, later incorporating number 17 as office space. The house, which was on the site of the present Treasury building at the end of Clive Steps, was eventually demolished, and the offices at number 17 were replaced by the Cabinet War Rooms. They had 3 children, born 10 years apart: Isambard, Henry Mark, and Florence. The Great Western Railway was to temporarily share a terminus at Euston with the London and Birmingham Railway, Brunel's initial design for Paddington Station was of Roman classical design with a temporary terminus at Bishop's Road. It wasn't until 1854 that the new Paddington Station, designed by Brunel and Matthew Digby Wyatt, was opened. The magnificent 700-foot long roof, which is made up of triangulated arched trusses of iron and glass, remains today. By the side entrance on Platform 1 is a statue of Brunel by John Doubleday. You can also see the balcony of Brunel's office above the platform. The Great Western Line to Bristol was part of Isambard Kingdom Brunel's grand vision, a link between London and New York. In 1836, Brunel was also appointed engineer of the Great Western Steamship Company, and work began in Bristol on his first ship design, the SS Great Western. She was an oak-hulled paddle steamer at 236 feet long, the biggest liner afloat. She made her maiden crossing from Bristol to New York in 1838, taking 15 days, providing the first transatlantic steam service and heralding a new era of ocean-going transport. Over the next 8 years, she made 60 crossings. It was finally broken up in 1857. And all that remains is her ship's bell. The box tunnel between Bath and Chippenham took 5 years to dig, and when the two tunnels met, one from each side of the hill, they were only 1 1/4 inches out from each other, even though the tunnel had been built with a deliberate bend in it. The cost of driving this tunnel, 1 7/8 of a mile long, was £100 for every yard advanced. Its construction was a great feat in those early days of railway engineering, and when completed, it was the largest railway tunnel in existence. To afford thorough ventilation, Brunel sank 6 shafts, varying from 70 to 300 feet deep, along the alignment of the tunnel. They can still be seen today. The tunnel was finished in 1841, and the ambition of the Bristol merchants to see trains running from London to Bristol was realized. In order to raise the railway to an adequate level to pass over Bristol's floating harbour, Brunel constructed Temple Mead Station on a series of arches. The first station building, which had been opened on the 31st of August 1840, was used for the Bristol and Exeter Railway for some time. The original timber-roof train shed designed by Brunel has been splendidly refurbished and now accommodates the Empire and Commonwealth Museum.
This is Brunel's Great Western Railway terminus, and it's one of the most important railway stations in the world. In fact, Brunel set out to create the first purpose-built railway station. What made it purpose-built, and why was that so important? Well, he aspired to put together all the various elements the make for a modern railway station. So we wanted the passenger shed, in which we're standing. He wanted an engine shed. He needed a goods area. He wanted an engineering workshop. He needed ticket offices. He wanted company offices. He also needed stabling for hundreds of horses. And here, on this site at Temple Meads, he brought together all these elements. And this is what is now Old Bristol Station. We're now actually in the passenger shed. Above us you can see the magnificent roof. Its span is 72 feet, which upon completion made it the biggest roof span in the world. Brunel had an initial problem. The city fathers of Bristol wouldn't allow the station to be built in the centre, so he had to pick a location on the edge of the city, and he chose the water meadows at Temple Meads. But he also wanted to create a railway that would be fast and convenient for the passengers. So he made sure that the station was created and built on arches so that it remained very, very flat. So beneath the passenger shed are a whole series of cavernous vaulted arches that support the railway. We are in actual fact on stilts. So beneath us we have arches. Above us we have this wonderful hammer beam roof. If we took you beyond the partition wall that you can see behind me, you would find yourself in an extension of the original terminus, designed by Digby Wyatt, who also worked on London Paddington. And eventually this station became totally superseded in 1965 by the new station at Temple Meads, just to the north and east.
On the 30th of June 1841, the directors of the Great Western Railway left London and made the first train journey on the 110-mile broad gauge line to Bristol Temple Meads station in 4 hours. The grand Elizabethan station at Bath remains in use today, although it lost its wooden roof at a very early stage. Brunel was usually involved in every detail of construction, not only devising the route, track, carriages and engines, but also the architecture and decorative details of the stations. As well as the hotels that were conveniently built close by. The classically designed railway bridges, tunnels and viaducts along this line were intended to conjure up images of ancient Rome, most evident as the line passes the elaborately balustraded cutting of Sydney Gardens. Construction began on the Great Western sister ship, the SS Great Britain, in 1839 at the Great Western Dockyard. She was launched by the Prince Consort in July 1843 to rapturous applause from the people of Bristol. She was the largest and most powerful ship to have been built to date. And the first screw propeller-driven, steam-powered iron ship to cross the Atlantic. Francis Pettit Smith, seen here surrounded by the ship's officers in the early 1850s, was the inventor of the screw propeller. Brunel's bold concept was a revolutionary departure in ship design and affected all subsequent marine architecture. She could carry 250 passengers and more than 1,000 tons of cargo. The SS Great Britain, running routes to New York and Melbourne, was the forerunner of today's passenger liner. It was not all plain sailing, however. On the 22nd of September 1846, she ran aground at Dundrum Bay in Ulster. Luckily, there were no fatalities, but it was a major setback for the Great Western Steamship Company, as the ship was not refloated again for almost a year, and finally put back into service. She served as a ferry carrying troops to the Crimea and India. And finally, as an emigrant and cargo ship, when she played an important role in building the emerging nation of Australia. In 1861, the ship carried the first All-England cricket team to play there. All of Brunel's ships had a mix of sails and engines, so that on days when there was no wind, they had engines to power them. But on windy days, the engines could be turned off to save fuel. They could also be used at the same time to enable the ships to go faster. After several years of service on the Australian run, the SS Great Britain was laid up in 1875 for 7 years. She was resold and her engines were removed, although she continued for a few more years as a sailing ship. She was abandoned in the Falkland Islands in 1886. And declined into a storage hulk, before being beached there in 1937. The ship had travelled 1.25 million nautical miles. Following her distinguished but occasionally ill-fated career, the SS Great Britain project was formed in 1968 to rescue the ship. And in 1970, she was returned to Bristol, where she has received extensive restoration and is now one of the major tourist attractions in the city. Brunel chose the small market town of Swindon to site the Great Western Railway's principal engine establishment.
Modern Swindon owes a great deal to Brunel. By choosing the northern route and aiming between Reading and Chippenham, he passed the small market town of Swindon, which was 1.5 miles up on the ridge. The second major decision that Brunel made was on the recommendation of his gifted engineer, Daniel Gooch, was to locate his main engine works at Swindon. The choice was a very good one. It was the only part of the main line that the Great Western Union Railway joined the original main line. So they had to have a large, well-established station at Swindon. Gooch was able to persuade Brunel that because of the conjunction of the lines, the access from the Wilts and Berks and the North Wilts Canal, and the fact that the duty that the locomotives would do between London and this point in the line west of Bristol was roughly equal. Because the line from London to Swindon was virtually level, it was colloquially called Brunel's billiard table, the locomotives didn't have to do nearly as much work as they would have to do in the final section when to surmount the difference between Swindon and Bristol. Having made that decision, Brunel designed just an engine repair facility. It was really just a maintenance garage. Indeed, the colloquial term at the time was an engine stable. This was to employ something like 140 skilled men, so therefore he had to provide some sort of accommodation for that workforce. So here we have the beginnings of Swindon Works and Swindon Railway Town. Over the next century, that town was to grow to its present-day population of almost 200,000, and the works at their height were to employ 14,000 people. But when Brunel left the scene, as far as this part of the Great Western Railway was concerned, it was very different. The painting by Edward Snell, done in 1849, encapsulates the Brunel phase. Snell's painting shows very much a greenfield site. There were very few pre-existing buildings, a small cluster around the North Wilts Canal. You can see in the distance the station, the raison d'etre for the work and settlement, and the junction of the two lines. To the north of that junction and west of that junction, we have the railway works. The layout of the original works was a running shed, and in fact that is where Brunel provided the only architectural embellishment to his works buildings in the form of two rather attractive plaques showing a Firefly class engine of 1841, the date of the running shed. At the eastern end of the works we have two-story ranges. The southern one, which has its end on to the works, contained a small suite of offices for the managers of the line operation itself. The second range to the north contained a pair of beam engines which drove on both floors huge lathes used for turning the components needed for repairs. Beyond is a range of smiths' shops and the original boiler shop. The central block is the very fine engine house or stable that Brunel created, and unfortunately nothing now survives of that other than its western wall, which now comprises the eastern wall of Steam, the museum of the Great Western Railway. Steam itself contains a large part of the second phase of the works, where a further turnnery with large steam engines drove lathes on both floors. And beyond steam, within the very heart of the designer village, are further ranges of Brunelian buildings.